All right, welcome back. 30 minutes now until the vote. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
And you as well, Dana. Nice to see you on a Saturday. Our coverage. We can do that if you like. Our coverage continues. Chris Wallace and Shannon Breen there live from Washington, D.C. So stay tuned. The vote's about 30 minutes away. Here we go on the Fox News Channel. Bye-bye.
This is a Fox News alert. It appears all but certain that Brett Kavanaugh will be the next Supreme Court justice. Welcome to our special coverage of the Kavanaugh confirmation vote. I'm Chris Wallace.
And I'm Shannon Breen. The countdown is on. We expect the final vote to take place within the hour. And while the outcome is expected to be 50-48 and one senator voting present, as we've seen throughout this entire 14-week drama, anything can happen. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell joins us live in just a minute.
But first, Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel kicks off our special coverage. Mike, what's the latest on the Hill?
Well, Chris, Shannon, good afternoon. The emphasis from Republican leaders is this confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh will be good for the country. They maintain Judge Kavanaugh is highly qualified and has been treated by some unfairly.
Due process should apply as much to the Senate's advise and consent responsibility as it should in a court of law. If we lose this basic concept of fairness, then we risk doing irreparable damage to the very foundation of our democracy and core conceptions of American justice and even liberty.
3 of the key swing senators we were watching announced in the past 24 hours they are yes on Judge Kavanaugh. Maine's Susan Collins, Arizona's Jeff Flake, and West Virginia Democrat Joe Manchin, the only Democrat expected to vote yes. The 4th moderate explained last night why she is a no.
In my conscience, because that's how I have to vote. The end of the day is with my conscience. I could not conclude that he is the right person for the court at this time.
Montana Republican Steve Daines is not going to be here for the vote. He has father of the bride duties, walking his daughter down the aisle, so that is why we will not have 100 votes today. This afternoon, some Democrats are complaining about this confirmation process.
The decision to plow right through will undermine and haunt the integrity of the Supreme Court for decades to come.
After nearly 30 hours of speeches, soon it will be time for the Senate to do this historic confirmation vote. Chris?
Mike, thank you so much. Joining us now, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Mr. Leader, welcome. Any doubts in your mind that you would get to this point today? And how do you move forward through a process that a lot of folks say now is irreparably damaged? How do you respond?
Well, nothing is irreparably damaged. This has been a nasty process, initiated in the beginning by Senate Judiciary Democrats and then carried over into the public. We've literally been under assault here by a mob that's going to our homes, brushing up against us in the halls, requiring enhanced security. But look, the good news is the mob didn't win. Justice will be done. We protected the presumption of innocence in this country. It applies in all walks of life and certainly in Supreme Court confirmations.
Well, you know, Senator Susan Collins obviously made the moment and made the big turn, a lot of people think, yesterday when she took to the floor at 3 p.m. And laid out in detail for about 40 minutes her case for why she would vote yes for Judge Kavanaugh. But she has split with at least Lisa Murkowski and then, of course, other colleagues across the aisle. Are those relationships going to take a little time, some of those wounds to heal up following this fight?
I don't think so. It's interesting. At the same time we were in the middle of this fight, we passed an opioid bill and an FAA bill by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. Just a few weeks ago, we completed the most of the appropriation bills before the end of the fiscal year for the first time in 20 years. Look, this has been a big fight, largely partisan, but there are plenty of other things that we're doing right along beside it on an overwhelming bipartisan basis.
Senator, I was talking to somebody who used to work for you and is a great admirer. He said Mitch McConnell has kind of a narrow emotional bandwidth, by which he meant that you don't need to run too hot or too cold, which is probably a pretty good thing in a Senate Majority Leader. But in this fight, were there times when you began to run pretty hot?
Well, there were times when I wondered whether we'd win, but I never considered for a moment quitting. That would have been unfair to Judge Kavanaugh. His reputation had been dragged through the mud for 2 weeks. He needed to have a vote. We needed to have a vote. The president and I had talked about, if we came up short, we were going to deal with another Supreme Court nominee this year. And so we were not going to allow this to go on for a multitude of reasons. Number one, it was not getting any better because you guys were having all kinds of uncorroborated, outrageous things thrown at you, trying to get you to publish them or put them on the air. This wasn't going to get better with the passage of time. And we also needed time if perchance we came up short. Look, the heroes of this story are Susan Collins and Jeff Flake. They wanted this additional 1-week investigation. They realized it couldn't be a fishing expedition. They defined the parameters of it, not the White House, but the senators in doubt. We got the report back in adequate time. They read it, reviewed it, and reached a decision. I'm thrilled that 2 of the 3 who went through this process are voting yes, and that's why we're going to put a new outstanding judge on the Supreme Court today.
Senator, you say that there were moments when you really had doubt whether or not the Kavanaugh nomination was going to go through. What was your moment of deepest doubt?
Well, I mean, obviously, Dr. Ford was very convincing. I remember the president and I talked after that and agreed that she'd made an effective presentation. I suggested, and he agreed, that was halftime. We needed to wait till the second half was over to take a look at the other side. We talked again after Judge Kavanaugh's performance. We thought it was spectacular that he knocked it out of the park. I don't think any of us ever discussed the possibility of withdrawal. But if there was a moment when you might wonder whether you were going to win, it certainly would have been after Dr. Ford's credible testimony.
And Senator, you mentioned a lot of the information that started to come through the floodgates once they were open. Many of these allegations were anonymous. They became more and more disturbing as we went along. Do you think there will be any accountability? Should there be for any of these cases in which what was alleged turns out to be demonstrably false?
Well, you know, we don't get to police the media, and a lot of the folks in your world, not you necessarily, would print this stuff or put it on the air with no corroboration whatsoever. Under the First Amendment, we don't get to tell you what to do. In terms of what the Senate Democrats may have done, I think Senator Graham, who's on the committees, indicated he thinks they need to take a look at it.
And one other question. You've got, you know, the spotlight, of course, is on Judge Kavanaugh right now, but you've got scores of other nominees. You've had very good success in getting a number of the president's dozens and dozens of his lower court nominees onto the bench. But what about those who are still waiting? Do you worry that what's happened over the last couple of weeks will impact those nominations?
Nope, we're going to do them all. The single most significant long-term thing this Senate has done is confirm the president's judges, not just to the Supreme Court, 2 new Supreme Court justices, 26 circuit court judges. There are more that will be done at both the circuit and district court level before the end of this year. I think it's the single most important thing we're doing with the longest impact on the country in a positive way.
Senator, at the beginning of our conversation here, you were talking about the mob and the fact that they didn't win. There was quite some extraordinary scenes of protesters, and we all value the First Amendment and the right of people to express their views. But as you were coming through the airport here at the beginning of the week, you were surrounded by protesters. Sometimes they were being members of Congress, as they were trying to talk to reporters, were being shouted down. I know they came to your house and other people's houses. Are you worried at all about the potential, not for fair statement of grievances, but this could become a security risk?
Well, look, I mean, I'm in retrospect kind of glad they did it, because what it's done is the one thing we were unable to do ourselves, which is to fire up our own base going into the election a month from now. Nothing turns Republicans of all stripes, whether they're Bush Republicans or Trump Republicans, on like a court fight. And they played right into our hands in retrospect, turned this into a big issue, put it front and center going into the November election, underscores how important keeping the Senate in the Republican majority is, so we can continue to confirm the president's judges for 2 more years. So as unpleasant as it's been worth it. They made a tactical mistake that really helped me unify my conference and turn on the Republican base going into the election. Maybe I ought to say thank you.
And just real briefly, because I know you got to get to the floor, any thought at all of new security measures because of the fear, and this could go either way, conservatives to Democratic senators, liberals to Republican senators, of a security threat?
I think it's best not to talk about security on the air.
Senator McConnell, we're going to leave it there, and you will join me on Fox News Sunday tomorrow. I'll also have an exclusive interview with Senate Judiciary Committee members Lindsey Graham and also Democratic Senator Ben Cardin. Check your local listings for time and channel.
All right, now we're being told the confirmation vote is expected to start around 3:50 Eastern time. We're watching the clock. Minority Leader Schumer and Majority Leader McConnell, we just talked with, are expected to speak before the vote happens.
Let's bring in our panel now. Charlie Hurt, opinion editor for the Washington Times, Carrie Severino, chief counsel for the Judicial Crisis Network, and Mo Elleithee, founding executive director of the Georgetown Institute of Politics. Mo, let me start with you. You just heard Senator McConnell say that, and I'm not talking about you, but the far left, the people that were protesting on the Hill. In fact, I think he says in an interview with the Washington Post overnight, gave Republicans a big political gift by energizing their base. Do you think that's true?
I think both sides find their bases incredibly energized right now. And a lot of that energy is driven by anger. Now, Democrats have been fairly energized and angry throughout this entire midterm crisis. This did give, as Leader McConnell said, Republicans a boost. As a Democrat, I find it a little funny when he says we couldn't energize our own folks, so Democrats had to do it for us. But if you believe, and I think there's some legitimacy to this argument, if you believe that a lot of this energy is driven by anger, as you look now towards the electoral process ahead of us, can Republicans, who are going to get a win in a couple of hours, sustain that anger? Will that anger remain? Will it remain energizing for them? Because I'll tell you, Democrats are coming out even more angry and more energized moving forward, and I think that's going to help them on Election Day.
Yeah, and Carrie, looking past this election, further down the road, we think of people like Senator Susan Collins, who made this epic speech yesterday in explaining her vote. I am sure you all did too. Got an inbox full of emails that were calling her a traitor and saying that she was betraying women and actually voting in favor of people who would harm women in so many ways. And listen, she told many of us, about the things that were coming into her office. We heard from staffers about the level of intimidation she's faced. Do you think that stays fired up to the point of her next election? Because they are saying, we will never forget what you did.
Yeah, I've seen some of those angry emails, but I've seen overwhelmingly the number of people saying this is so important and praising her. Her speech was so thoughtful and well executed, I thought, especially talking about how important the Me Too movement is, and that a vote to confirm Kavanaugh, this is not a vote saying we don't believe women. This can be very important, but you have to judge each case on its own merits. And of course, she laid out in very clear detail how she viewed the merits of the case, as well as going really into Judge Kavanaugh's actual judicial record, which we've sort of gotten lost in this whole process. So I think that was an amazing moment for her, and I do think it's one that people will remember in a very positive light as well, because she was the person who stood up and showed the deliberation and thoughtfulness that we would hope that a lot more senators would show.
Let me just step in here for a second to set the scene, because it looks now like the final vote on confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh is going to take place there on the Senate floor around 3:50, so about 37 minutes from now. And of course, we will have live coverage of the final speeches and the roll call, which, even if you think you know what's going to happen, is still always very dramatic. And it's interesting to point out, Charlie, that this was supposed to happen if they had taken the full 30 hours, which happens after cloture is invoked, the filibuster is cut off. That would have taken us to 4:52 p.m., so about an hour later. I think there's one thing even more important than everybody getting their say, and that this is a holiday weekend and people just want to get out of town.
Yeah, and it's been a pretty nasty couple of weeks, and I don't blame anybody for wanting to get out of town. I've been covering these judicial nomination fights since the beginning of the Bush years, when this current episode we're sort of going through first began with the filibuster of Miguel Estrada to the D.C. Circuit Court. And I feel like I've seen nasty stuff, but what we have seen over the past couple of weeks has been nastier than than anything I've ever experienced with this fight. And I get the argument that a lot of Democrats try to make right now that this isn't a court of law, so this is a confirmation fight to the Supreme Court. Due process isn't a legal standard that applies here. Well, that may be true technically, but the problem was the fundamental unfairness and the dishonesty of so many of the attacks that were leveled against Brett Kavanaugh, so many of which were so preposterous that they were unbelievable on the face. And that's a new level of low that I think we've reached, and it's a very sad thing if you care about the country and you care about the courts. But the one silver lining in all of it, I think, as Carrie pointed out, was that speech from Susan Collins, which was one of the, I think it's probably the most beautiful speech I've ever seen delivered on the Senate floor, that dealt with both the issue at hand, but also talked about what we're supposed to stand for and talked about what the Republic is supposed to be doing in times like these. And it was, and I hope that we all sort of sit back and I printed out a copy of it, and I've read it like 3 times since, and I'll continue to read it. It was a very powerful, important speech.
All right, we are standing by because in just seconds you're going to hear from the president. He left the White House earlier today. He's going to fly into Topeka, Kansas. He's got a big rally there tonight. He apparently stopped and made some comments before he was heading out, knowing that we're going into this vote today, and it's been a long haul for the White House as well. Let's listen.
To the vote. He will be a great justice of the Supreme Court. People have thought that for 10 years. They thought he's just an extraordinary person, a great talent, and I think he's going to make us all very proud. I also feel very strongly that in the end, maybe the process, it was really unattractive, but the extra week was something that I think was really good. I thought it was really good. I think a lot of very positive things happened in the last week. It didn't look that way, but in the end, that's what happened. It was uncorroborated. It was so many different things. He's going in looking very good, but I'll have further comment later. I want to go. I want to watch the vote. I'm heading out to Kansas. Chris Kobach is running for governor. Steve Watkins is running for Congress. We have a big crowd, and I look forward to it. We'll be watching in a little while. We'll be watching on television the vote, and the votes are very exciting. This is a very exciting time. Any time you have a chance to put a Supreme Court justice in position, and in this case, I think he's going to be a great Supreme Court justice for many years. It's a very exciting time. So we're going to Kansas, but we'll see you in a little while after the vote. Say it again. I thought that Susan was incredible yesterday. You could see how hard she worked, how hard she was working. She didn't stop. And I know for a fact, because I spoke with her, she didn't stop. And she gave an impassioned, beautiful speech yesterday, and that was from the heart. That was from the heart. I have great respect for Susan Collins, and I always have. Thank you. Thank you.
Going to go leaving from the White House there, praising, you heard him, Senator Susan Collins, telling reporters he's going to watch the vote on TV like we hope millions of other Americans do with us.
Absolutely. And, let me explain a little bit about what's going on here, which is that the president is going to be making his remarks, but that's going to be at 7:30 Eastern, which is too late for all the newspapers in the East Coast or for the evening news. So the president wants to get his remarks on the evening news tonight in the Sunday morning papers. So by making that statement, when he did, he puts a placeholder there. And then, of course, he'll make more extensive remarks at the rally tonight, which I assume will be a victory celebration, because at that point, Judge Kavanaugh will be Justice Kavanaugh. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts joins us now from the North Lawn. John, looks like the president's feeling pretty good.
Yeah, the Sunday morning paper, such a quaint idea in this electronic world.
Well, I'm an old guy. What can I say?
I got 2 questions to the president as he came out. The first one was, well, how are you feeling about the vote, and what do you think of the process that the nation went through to get to where we are. And that was the driver of his first answer there, where you heard him say that he's looking very, very much forward to Judge Kavanaugh. Doesn't think that the process was a good one, though, but in the end, some positive things happened. My second question to him was, you and Senator Collins have not always seen eye to eye. In fact, earlier this week, she said that what the president said at that rally in northern Mississippi was just absolutely wrong, but that she came out so forcefully in favor of Judge Kavanaugh, and that's when the president said what he did about Senator Collins. But for the president, this is going to be a very big moment. Personally and politically. You know, when you're a president, he has said many, many times, and other presidents have said it, picking a justice for the Supreme Court is probably, other than committing men and women into harm's way with our military, the most important decision that a president can make. Politically, it likely would have been a disaster for him in the midterm elections had he had to withdraw Kavanaugh's name from consideration. I mean, the Republican base might have been angered and somewhat energized, but I think that the Republican Party would have been so deflated from that. And then questions about what comes next and could you get somebody else confirmed in a lame duck session of Congress, not knowing what the outcome of the election is going to be. The president really put all of his political power behind getting Kavanaugh through, and we will find out within about 90 minutes or so if it worked. But the White House believes it will have a 50-48 vote to confirm Kavanaugh. Now, this might not end it, because Democrats, some Democrats at least, have said that if they were to take control of the House after the November elections, they may begin impeachment proceedings against Judge Kavanaugh. So we still may have a way to go, but at least in the near term, what happens this afternoon, if it comes out as the president believes it will be a huge political victory for him. Chris?
All right, John Roberts, live at the White House. Thank you very much. Senators are expected to begin voting any minute now on Supreme Court nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Both sides of the aisle have been critical of the precedent. The supercharged Kavanaugh hearings have now set for Supreme Court nominees in the future.
Joining us now to weigh in is Harvard Law Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz. Professor, good to talk with you. Your thoughts about how this process has played out and the fact that we're going to get Justice Brett Kavanaugh, if the schedule holds, in about 45 minutes.
Well, I think it would be a disaster if the Democrats, if they were to gain control of the House, were to look backwards and try to do revenge investigations and revenge impeachments. First of all, it would be unconstitutional to impeach a sitting justice for what he may or may not have done when he was 17 years old and a private citizen. It would also be a pretext to say, oh, no, we're not going after him for what he did when he was 17. We're going after him because of what he said he did when he was being confirmed in the Senate, and he was then a sitting judge. It would be a disgrace to the Constitution if the Democrats, if they were to gain control, were to engage in that kind of petty score settling. Look, I'm a Democrat. I want to see the Democrats regain control of the House, but I don't want to see them fritter away their power to serve as a check and balance by trying to pretend that they're the avenging angel and can't look to the future and has to just look to even the score looking backwards. The American public does not want that.
Yeah, Professor, with the impeachment aside, what about this issue of perjury? Because there are a number of people stepping forward saying, at the very least, they think there should be an attempt to look at Judge Kavanaugh, the statements that he made along the way, and other evidence, and others who have come forward to say he wasn't completely truthful. Is that also a fool's errand in your estimation?
It's worse than a fool's errand. It's hypocrisy. These are the very same Democrats who complained when the Republicans did this to Bill Clinton, when they said, oh, we're not going after him for sex in the White House. We're going after him for his perjury about what he said about sex. It's total, complete make-weight, and it's below the dignity of the House of Representatives. This matter should end with the confirmation. We should look forward. Look, I'm optimistic. As a civil libertarian and a liberal, I think that it's very possible that Justice Kavanaugh has really become very sensitized to issues of due process, to issues of freedom of speech, to the presumption of innocence. People learn from their own experiences. We certainly appointed people like Thurgood Marshall and Justice Ginsburg and Justice Sotomayor because they had experiences which made them sensitive to the violation of civil liberties. Now we have Justice Kavanaugh, who may be increasingly sensitive to these issues. So as a civil libertarian, I'm looking forward with some degree of enthusiasm. Now, he's going to vote against my views on abortion and gay rights, but that's what happens when you have an election. The president gets to appoint his nominee to the Supreme Court. If the Democrats had won, they'd be appointing their nominees. But this process has just been awful. And now it's spreading to Harvard Law School, where student mobs want to prevent him from teaching. He's been teaching for many years in a distinguished way. It reminds me of when I was in college and students and faculty were firing faculty members because they said they were communists when they were 20 years old or 21 years old. And it didn't matter whether they're innocent or guilty. As long as there was suspicion of communism, that's enough. And if they responded by being angry, oh, now they can't teach because they have expressed anger and they show that they're not suitable for teaching. It is such an old McCarthyite technique. It makes me sick to the stomach as a liberal.
I have to say, Professor, that, it's one thing to fool around with the Supreme Court and the Senate, but when you fool around with Harvard Law School, you've gone too far.
That's right. Oh, absolutely.
Final question, and we're beginning to run out of time. But to what degree do you think that Justice Kavanaugh, assuming that what we think is going to happen in the next half hour does, to what degree do you think that will really shift the balance on the court and make this a solid conservative majority court?
Any nominee of President Trump would have shifted the balance. If he had nominated the judge from the Seventh Circuit, it would have shifted the balance even more. She is well to the right of Kavanaugh. I think we'll see a shift, but we would see a shift no matter what. The Democrats aren't going to get this nomination. Look, they had a nomination stolen from them with when President Obama nominated Merrick Garland. I objected to that. I think it was an outrage. But, this is the way politics works, and there will be a shift. And if the Democrats get elected, there'll be a shift back. That's the way the Supreme Court has operated for generations.
Professor Alan Dershowitz, thank you very much for your time today, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Right now, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is speaking on the Senate floor. We want to take you there live.
Least fair, most biased processes in Senate history, slanting the table from the very beginning to produce their desired result. Why do I say this? Because they withheld over 90% of the nominee's record from the Senate and the American people. Because they refused to allow Dr. Ford to call a single corroborating witness at the hearing, including the only other eyewitness to the incident. Because they refused to have an independent investigation of the facts before the hearing in order to inform the questioning. Because they hired an outside prosecutor to question Dr. Ford as if she were on trial. Because the White House kept the FBI investigation on a short leash, dictating the scope and even the kinds of questions the FBI was allowed to ask. Because Republican senators, sensing after Dr. Ford's testimony that a debate about the truth and facts was not working, adopted a cynical new strategy to shout, pound the table, and portray Judge Kavanaugh as the helpless victim of some unseen partisan conspiracy. Because the President of the United States stooping to new depths, even for him, chose to stand before a crowd of thousands and cruelly ridicule a survivor of sexual assault. And because this grossly distorted, biased, unfair process run by the Republican majority, the Senate is about to elevate a nominee who doesn't belong on the nation's highest bench. Now, why doesn't Judge Kavanaugh belong on the bench in the nation's highest court? Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he obscured his views, shrouding his jurisprudence in smoke so thick the American people would never know what he really believed. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he was chosen by a president and a far-right organization, both dedicated to overturning and undermining Roe v. Wade, and he did not a thing to refute the presumption that he would want to overturn it too. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he was chosen by far-right organizations that are bent on repealing health care protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. And he did nothing to refute the presumption that he would too. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he believes that presidents should not be subject to investigations of any kind while in office, a distortion of our founding principle that no person is above the law. Judge Kavanaugh does not belong on the bench because his jurisprudence is deeply skeptical of environmental protections, consumer protections, workers' rights, civil rights, LGBT rights, and rights of treaties and agreements with Native Americans, and a host of other hard-earned rights. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he has repeatedly misled the Senate, putting into serious doubt his credibility, and a judge must be credible, believable, and honest above all. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because he is an extreme partisan, something we have seen from his earliest days in his career and reconfirmed when he gave one of the bitterest, most partisan testimonies ever presented by a nominee. Judge Kavanaugh doesn't belong on the bench because of his injudicious demeanor. His partisan screed will go down ignominiously in history, and made it clear it would be virtually impossible for him to rule impartially on the Supreme Court. Judges must be temperate, judicious, even-handed. Judge Kavanaugh is anything but. Republican leaders knew before he was nominated that Judge Kavanaugh was a very flawed choice. But once President Trump selected him, Republicans decided they had to rush him through. They became a steamroller over truth, fairness, and our traditions of bipartisan cooperation, any means necessary to reach their desired end. They blamed Dr. Ford and Democrats for Judge Kavanaugh's flaws. They were intent on shrouding the truth because they knew that if the truth came to light, Judge Kavanaugh would be exposed as a truly flawed nominee. So, my colleagues, my fellow Americans, what is the appropriate response? Our country needs to have a reckoning on these issues, and there is only one remedy. Change must come from where change in America always begins, the ballot box. So to Americans, the so many millions who are outraged by what happened here, there's one answer: vote. If you believe Dr. Ford and other brave women who came forward, and you want to vindicate their sacrifice, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court should uphold women's rights, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court must protect health care and our pre-existing conditions that are protected now, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court should defend workers, consumers, the environment, civil rights, native populations, vote. If you believe the Supreme Court should be a check on an overreaching president, vote. If you believe the process here in the Senate was a sham, and you believe Americans deserve better, vote. If you believe that Supreme Court justices should conform to the highest standards of character, impartiality, temperament, and above all, honesty and credibility, vote. I understand, I share the deep anguish that millions of Americans are experiencing today. But I say to you, my fellow Americans, there is one answer: vote. I yield the floor.
You know, it's interesting because we saw new Fox News polling this week in some of these key Senate races in these red states where they've been very tight. And a lot of our pollsters have said, in looking at the results and the way things are moving, they do believe that the Kavanaugh impact is going to benefit the GOP. Now, Democrats had a sizable intensity advantage. So whether or not they're now on even or level playing ground because of this, not sure, but certainly it's woken up the GOP.
You know, it's interesting. In effect, what you heard there was the Democratic leader, and we'll just go in a second to the Republican leader, Chuck Schumer, conceding defeat on the vote in the Senate and saying, now let's take this to the voters and make this an issue in the midterm elections. And now the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell.
Mr. President, Kentucky's on. They underscore that the decision United States senators will make today will echo in the history of our nation. The very survival of our constitutional form of government requires an expert and independent judiciary. Without fair and impartial courts of justice, as Alexander Hamilton put it in the Federalist Papers, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. The courts guard our rights, and the Senate guards our courts. That, Mr. President, is why today is such an important day. That is why the vote we take this afternoon, a vote to confirm a new Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, represents one of the most consequential decisions a senator ever makes. The members of this body are duty-bound to ensure we confirm justices of the Supreme Court who are men and women of the highest character and the most superlative qualifications. So fortunately, that is just the sort of nominee who stands before us today. 12 weeks ago, the President nominated a jurist who's been described by legal peers of all political stripes as a superstar, a serious scholar, and who is legendary for his preparation and possesses the qualifications, the temperament, and the judicial philosophy to be an excellent Associate Justice. The President nominated a brilliant student of the law. Those who taught and knew the nominee at Yale say, quote, "It is hard to name anyone with judicial credentials as strong as Judge Kavanaugh." They describe a true intellectual, a leading thinker, and a wonderful mentor and teacher. And those he's mentored, a diverse group of bright young lawyers who've clerked for Judge Kavanaugh, talk about his work ethic, his unflinching, honest advice, and his fundamental humility. For 12 weeks, the Senate has seen that this is not empty praise. We've seen the legendary preparation of a tireless judge. We've seen the patience of a committed mentor and teacher. We've seen the humility of a true intellectual who let his record speak for itself. Each of us have seen this for ourselves. Every senator who came into this process with an open mind has seen that very same Brett Kavanaugh firsthand. We've seen his brilliance, his painstaking thoroughness on display in the 300-plus opinions he issued on the D.C. Circuit. For 12 years, Judge Kavanaugh excelled on the bench that many experts see as the second most important court in our nation. We've seen his geniality and kindness firsthand in our private meetings with the nominee, precisely the collegial approach that is so necessary on the court. We've seen his professional excellence as we reviewed more pages of documents pertaining to Judge Kavanaugh's career than for any other Supreme Court nomination in our history. Pages that depict a meticulous and dedicated public servant. And yes, we have now studied the results of seven FBI background investigations, inquiries that have produced no evidence whatsoever to corroborate any prior misconduct, but rather are consistent with all we know about this nominee's sterling character. This historically tall mountain of evidence adds up to one clear message. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is among the very best our nation has to offer. He will make the Senate and the country proud. He will serve with distinction on our highest court. He unquestionably deserves confirmation, and the country deserves such a Supreme Court justice. Now, Mr. President, as I've explained, the stakes are always high where a Supreme Court confirmation is concerned. But this time, the stakes are higher, a lot higher than they've been in the past. I can't sum this up better than our friend and distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Maine, put it in her historic remarks yesterday. This is what the senior senator from Maine said. It is when passions are most inflamed that fairness is most in jeopardy. She said, when passions are most inflamed is when fairness is most in jeopardy. We all know the events of recent weeks have strained the country's comedy and fanned the flames of partisan discord. But even more critically, our very commitment to the basic principles of fairness and justice is also being tested. Basic principles of fairness and justice being tested right here. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is also a vote to send a clear message about what the Senate is. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is the chamber in which the politics of intimidation and personal destruction do not win the day. That this is the body whose members themselves uphold the same commitment to American justice that we seek in the judges we examine. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is a vote to end this brief, dark chapter in the Senate's history and turn the page toward a brighter tomorrow. The chamber we are privileged to occupy is often called the world's greatest deliberative body for good reason. We're called the world's greatest deliberative body for a good reason. When the rubber meets the road, when the hour is critical, when a historic precedent needs to be set, the United States Senate most often finds its way to doing what is right. Today, we can honor that history. We can vote to turn away from the darkness. We can vote to set a precedent about fairness and judgment that will define this body for the better. We can vote to confirm an excellent Supreme Court justice who will make the Senate and the American people proud. I yield the floor.
All right, you've been watching there where the two top leaders of the Senate have spoken, the top Democrat, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, top Republican, Mitch McConnell, and now you see Vice President Mike Pence is actually presiding over the Senate. Of course, if there was a matter of a tie, he would be the tiebreaker. He's just taken that seat, and we're told that most Republicans are in their seats, but many of the Democrat seats remain empty at this point.
But this will be one of those rare moments by the end of this vote when all, well, I was going to say 100 seats, 99 seats will be filled. Steve Daines is walking his daughter down the aisle, but now the vote is going to be taken. Let's listen in.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. sufficient second?
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms has restored order in the galleries. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk may continue.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Zoom.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin.
Clerk will suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Clerk may continue.
Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
With my friend, the senator from Montana, Senator Daines, who is walking his daughter down the aisle this afternoon. If he were present and voting, he would have voted aye. I have voted no. The pair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
The senator has that right.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman.
We are going to pause for a moment now to let our Fox stations join us.
Scott, Shelby, Sullivan.
Welcome to our Fox News live coverage of the Senate vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. I'm Chris Wallace.
And I'm Shannon Breen. We are here in Washington. You're going to listen live as they're talking through the votes now, the roll call, as you listen to hear the tallies, what at this moment appear to be a confirmation for Kavanaugh.
Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Jones, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no.